There's a specific kind of silence you only find out on the water. It's not the absence of sound. Exactly, it's more like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to break the surface. If you've spent your life on a boat, you know what I'm talking about. You know the way the air changes right before a squall, or how the water turns a certain shade of bruised purple when the sun starts to dip below the horizon. I've been fishing the Gulf Coast for nearly 30 years. My father was a charter captain, and his father before him. For me, the ocean was never something to fear. It was just home. It was the place where the rules of the land didn't apply, where the only thing that mattered was the tide and the wind. But as I've gotten older, that comfort has started to fray at the edges. I've seen things, or maybe it's more accurate to say I've felt things that I can't explain away with logic or marine biology. People think the scariest thing about the ocean is what's underneath the boat. And sure, there are monsters down there. But for me, the real horror starts when the things that should be familiar suddenly feel wrong. The first story I want to tell you happened about 6 years ago. It was late October, that sweet spot where the humidity finally breaks and the redfish are biting like crazy in the shallow flats. I was out with my best friend Mark. We'd grown up together, learned to tie our first knots on the same dock. We didn't even need to talk much anymore. We just had this rhythm. We'd reach for the net or the bait bucket at the exact same time, two halves of the same brain. We were in my 18-foot skiff, a sturdy little boat that could get into water so skinny you'd swear you were sliding over wet grass. We'd headed out around 4 a.m. to catch the incoming tide at a spot we called the Graveyard. It wasn't named for anything macabre, just a bunch of old, bleached cedar stumps sticking out of the water that looked like tombstones. The morning was perfect. The kind of morning that makes you feel lucky to be alive. The water was like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the stars so clearly it felt like we were floating in space. We reached the stumps just as the first hint of gray started to bleed into the eastern sky. "Check the GPS," Mark whispered. We always whispered out there. Anything louder felt like a violation. I looked down at the screen. The little blue triangle that represented our boat was right where it should be. But then I looked up. About 50 yards ahead of us, there was an island. Now, you have to understand, we knew this stretch of the coast like the back of our hands. There are no islands in the Graveyard. There are sandbars that shift with the seasons, sure, but this was a solid mass of land, covered in thick, dark vegetation that looked like it had been there for 100 years. You see that, right? Mark asked, his voice a little tighter than before. Yeah, I said, squinting through the pre-dawn gloom. Must be a new deposit. Maybe that storm last week pushed a bunch of debris together, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Storms don't grow 20-foot-tall mangroves overnight. We let the boat drift closer, the engine idling so low it was barely a hum. As the light grew, the island became clearer. It was perfectly circular, maybe 60 feet across. The mangroves were dense, their tangled roots reaching down into the water like skeletal fingers. But something was off. Mangroves are usually teeming with life. You should hear the clicks of snapping shrimp, the splash of a mullet, the cry of a heron. This place was dead silent. Not a single bird sat in those branches. The water around the island didn't even ripple. It was as if the island was absorbing every bit of energy from the surrounding environment. "Let's get a closer look," Mark suggested. I could tell he was uneasy, but curiosity is a powerful thing for a fisherman. We thought maybe we'd found a honey hole, a place no one else knew about, where the big reds were hiding. As we pulled within 10 feet of the shore, a smell hit us. It wasn't the usual salty, sulfurous scent of the marsh. It was sweet, sickeningly sweet, like rotting lilies mixed with something metallic. It made my stomach do a slow, heavy roll. "Look at the sand," I whispered, pointing to a small opening in the roots. The beach wasn't made of sand or shells. It was white, yes, but it was too uniform. I nudged the boat forward until the bow gently touched the edge. I reached down with my push-pull and poked at the white ground. It wasn't sand, it was bone. Thousands, maybe millions of tiny, bleached white fish bones, packed so tightly together they formed a solid surface. There were larger bones mixed in too, rib cages that looked too big for a fish. skulls that didn't have the right shape for a dolphin or a turtle. Mark backed away from the bow, his face pale in the morning light. "We need to go. Now. Wait," I said. My eyes locked on the center of the island. Through the thicket of mangroves, I could see something standing. It was a chair. A simple wooden kitchen chair, painted a bright primary yellow. It sat perfectly upright in the middle of that island of bones, looking brand new, as if someone had just placed it there and stepped away. But there were no footprints, no paths through the brush, just that yellow chair, glowing in the dim light. And then I saw the movement. It wasn't a person, it was the roots. The mangrove roots were moving, not swaying in the wind, because there was no wind. They were times contracting, slowly, rhythmically, like a throat swallowing. I didn't wait for Mark to tell me twice. I slammed the boat into reverse. The engine roared, a violent intrusion into that heavy silence. As the prop kicked up mud and water, the island seemed to shudder. I turned the boat around and pinned the throttle. We didn't look back until we were miles away, back in the main channel with the sun fully over the horizon. When we finally stopped, we just sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. "Don't tell anyone," Mark said. His hands were shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. "Who would believe us?" I replied. The weirdest part wasn't finding the island. It was what happened the next day. I went back. I know, I'm an idiot, but I had to know. I took the GPS coordinates. I went back to the exact same spot at the exact same tide. There was nothing, just the cedar stumps, the open water, and 10 feet of depth. No bones, no mangroves, and no yellow chair. I checked my GPS log. The track from the day before was there. It showed us stopping in the middle of the graveyard, idling for 20 minutes, and then racing back. But when I looked at the satellite overlay on my phone for that specific coordinate, there was nothing but blue. To this day, I can't look at a mangrove forest without feeling a chill. I keep thinking about that chair. Who was it for? And what would have happened if I'd stepped off the boat and sat down? That feeling of wrongness isn't always as obvious as a disappearing island. Sometimes, it's a slow realization that the person sitting across from you isn't who you think they are. This second story took place a few years later. I was doing a solo overnight trip about 40 miles offshore. I wanted to hit the shelf at dawn for some tuna. It was a calm night, the kind of night where the stars are so bright they actually cast a shadow on the deck. I had the autopilot set, the radar scanning, and I was just leaning back in my helm chair, enjoying the solitude. Around 2 a.m., a voice came over the VHF radio. "Help, please. Is anyone out here?" It was a woman's voice. She sounded calm, unnervingly calm, but there was an underlying tremor, like she was trying very hard not to scream. I grabbed the mic immediately. "This is the time, Sea Rambler. I hear you. What's your position and the nature of your distress?" There was a long pause, just static. Then, "I'm in the white boat. Can you see the white boat?" I looked at my radar. There wasn't a single blip within 20 miles of me. "Ma'am, I don't have you on my radar. Do you have GPS coordinates? Or can you fire a flare?" "It's so dark," she said. "I can see your light. You're so close. Why won't you just look at me?" I stood up, grabbing my spotlight. I scanned the horizon, 360 degrees. Nothing. Just the endless, empty black of the Atlantic. "I don't see you," I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "Are you taking on water? Are you injured?" "I'm just waiting," she whispered. And then the radio went dead. I spent the next 3 hours circling that area, shining my light until the battery started to dim. I called the Coast Guard, gave them my location. They sent a plane out at first light. They searched for 12 hours. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no white boat. But that's not the part that keeps me up at night. The part that keeps me up is what I found on my own boat the next morning. When the sun came up, I went to the back of the deck to wash down some salt spray. There, on the very edge of the transom, right next to the outboard motor, were 2 wet handprints, small handprints, like a woman's They were pointing inward, as if someone had reached up from the water and pulled themselves halfway up, just enough to look over the edge and watch me while I was talking to them on the radio. I was 40 miles from land. The water was 2,000 feet deep, and I had been alone, or so I thought. I took a long break from the water after that. I sold the boat, moved a bit further inland, and tried to convince myself that the handprints were just some strange residue from the salt or a trick of the morning light. But the thing about the water is that it's a hard habit to break. It calls to you. There's a certain peace in the middle of a lake or a bay that you just can't find on dry land. After 2 years, I found myself back at a marina, looking at a used 19-foot center console. I told myself I'd stay closer to shore this time. No more overnight trips. No more 40-mile runs. My second story takes place about 3 years ago. I'd started fishing with a guy named Elias. Elias was one of those old-school Florida locals who seemed to have been cured in salt and sun. He was 70 if he was a day, with skin like cracked leather and a laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. He knew the 10,000 islands like the back of his hand. If you've never been there, it's a labyrinth of mangroves, oyster bars, and shallow creeks on the edge of the Everglades. It's beautiful, but it's the kind of place where you can get lost in 5 minutes if you don't know what you're doing. We used to head out at 3 a.m. to catch the outgoing tide. There's a specific kind of magic in those islands at that hour. The air is thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decaying vegetation, that swamp smell that sounds gross to outsiders but feels like home to a fisherman. We'd sit in the dark, the only light coming from the green glow of the GPS and the occasional flash of a bioluminescent wake when a shark or a snook moved near the surface. One August night, the heat was oppressive. Even at 3 a.m., the sweat was beaded on our foreheads. We were anchored in a deep channel between 2 large mangrove islands, waiting for the tarpon to start rolling. It was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, which was the first thing that felt off. In the glades, if the mosquitoes aren't eating you alive, something is wrong. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. Elias was rigging a live mullet when he stopped. He tilted his head, listening. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound drifted across the water from deep inside the mangroves. It sounded like a bell, a small, silver bell, ringing softly. Clink, clink, clink. It was rhythmic, steady, and completely out of place. There are no houses in that part of the islands. No trails, nothing but miles of impassable roots and black mud. "Probably a buoy," I said, though I knew there weren't any buoys in this backcountry channel. Elias didn't answer. He reached for his spotlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the wall of mangroves. The light hit the tangled roots, turning them a ghostly white. And then, we saw it. About 50 yards away, tucked back in a small notch in the trees, was a boat. It wasn't a fishing boat. It was an old wooden skiff, the kind you'd see in a museum. It had no motor, no oars, and it was painted a vibrant polished red that looked brand new. Hanging from a small wooden pole at the bow was a silver bell. It was swinging back and forth, even though the water was like glass and there wasn't a breath of wind. But it wasn't the boat that made my blood run cold. It was the person sitting in it. A man was sitting in the middle of the skiff, dressed in a tuxedo. A full, black tuxedo with a crisp white shirt and a bow tie. He was sitting perfectly upright, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead, not at us, but down the channel toward the open gulf. He was so still, he looked like a mannequin. "Hey!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking the silence. "You all right? You need help?" The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. The bell just kept ringing. Clink, clink, clink. Elias started to pull the anchor. "We're getting out of here," he muttered. He didn't even bother with the trolling motor. He fired up the main engine, and the roar felt like a physical relief. As we began to back out of the channel, I kept the spotlight on the red boat. As the beam passed over the man's face one last time, he finally moved. He didn't turn his head. He just smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His mouth opened too wide, stretching unnaturally far toward his ears, and for a split second, the light reflected off his teeth. They weren't human teeth. They were small, sharp, and numerous, like the rows of teeth in a barracuda's mouth. We didn't stop until we reached the lighted channel near the marina. Elias never spoke about it. He sold his boat a week later and moved to Tennessee. I still go out occasionally, but I never go near the 10,000 islands at night. I sometimes wonder who that man was waiting for and why he was dressed for a celebration in the middle of a swamp. That brings me to the third story, which happened just last summer. This one is harder to talk about because I still can't find a rational explanation for it, and it makes me question my own sanity. I was fishing solo on a lake in central Florida. It's a huge lake, miles across, known for its trophy base. I'd been out since dawn and was having a great day. By noon, the sun was high and the bite had slowed down, so I decided to pull into a shaded cove to eat some lunch and take a nap under the bimini top. The cove was peaceful, surrounded by tall cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. I dropped the shallow water anchors and drifted off to the sound of the water lapping against the hull. I must have slept for about an hour. When I woke up, the atmosphere had shifted. The bright Florida sun was gone, replaced by a weird, bruised purple sky. A storm was coming, but it didn't look like a normal afternoon thunder shower. The clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost mechanical. I started to stow my gear, moving quickly. As I reached for the anchor remote, I looked over the side of the boat into the shallow, tea-colored water. There, about 3 feet down, I saw a face. It was my face, but it wasn't a reflection. The me in the water was wearing a different shirt, a blue one I hadn't worn in years. The me in the water looked older, tired, and deeply sad. It was looking up at me from the lake bed, its eyes wide and pleading. It reached a hand up toward the surface, its fingers brushing the underside of the water's skin. I scrambled back, tripping over my tackle box. When I looked again, the face was gone. There was nothing but the sandy bottom and a few stalks of eelgrass. I started the engine and hammered the throttle, flying across the lake to the ramp. I didn't even wait to tie the boat down properly on the trailer. I just winched it up and drove away. When I got home, I went straight to my closet. I started digging through old boxes until I found it. At the bottom of a bin of old clothes was the blue shirt. I'd thrown it away 3 years ago, as I was wearing it the day my father passed away. I vividly remember putting it in the trash. Yet, there it was. Damp. Smelling of lake water and lilies. I haven't been back to that lake. In fact, I haven't been on a boat in 6 months. People tell me it's just island fever, or the way the light plays on the water. They say the mind creates patterns where there are none to cope with the isolation of the sea. But how do you explain the handprints? How do you explain the man in the tuxedo with the rows of silver teeth? How do you explain a shirt that was buried in a landfill appearing in my closet, dripping with the water of a lake that saw a version of me that shouldn't exist? The water is a mirror, but sometimes it shows us things we aren't meant to see. It's a graveyard that never stays full. Am I overthinking this? Maybe. Maybe it's all just a series of impossible coincidences. But the next time you're out there, and the wind dies down, and the birds go silent, take a look over the side. Just make sure that whatever's looking back at you is actually your reflection. What do you think? Have you ever seen something on the water that shouldn't be there? Tell me your stories in the comments. I'd love to know I'm not the only one the water is watching.